The small town of Ash Hollow was known for its dense fog that rolled in every evening, swallowing the streets in an eerie blanket of silence. But locals didn't fear the fog itself. They feared what it brought with it. Tales of disappearances and strange occurrences had been whispered for decades. Most dismissed them as urban legends, but one story stood out. It was the story of the Watchers, shadowy figures that appeared in the mist. No one knew who they were or what they wanted, but their presence was undeniable. Marianne was a freelance journalist drawn to the macabre. When she stumbled upon the stories of Ash Hollow online, she knew she had to investigate. Armed with her camera, a flashlight, and a notebook, she rented a cabin on the outskirts of town where the fog was said to be the thickest. Her first few days were uneventful. The townsfolk were tight-lipped, offering little more than nervous glances when she mentioned the Watchers. But Marianne was determined. On the third night, as the fog crept in like a living entity, she ventured out with her camera. The world beyond her flashlight was a void, the dense fog muffling every sound. The air felt charged, electric. She snapped pictures at random, her heart pounding against her ribs. It wasn't long before she heard it, a faint whisper, unintelligible but unmistakably human. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly she turned, shining her flashlight into the mist. Nothing. But as she reviewed her photos later that night, her blood turned to ice. In the corner of one frame, barely visible, was a figure. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs elongated, its face obscured. Its presence radiated malice, even through the grainy image. The next night, curiosity and fear warred within her. She told herself it was a trick of the light, a smudge on the lens. But deep down, she knew better. Against her better judgment, she ventured out again. This time, the whispers came sooner, closer. She could almost make out words. Her flashlight flickered, then died. Panic set in as she fumbled with her camera, desperate for some light. When the flash went off, it illuminated a figure standing mere feet away. Its eyes glowed like embers, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Marianne ran, the fog seeming to pull at her like invisible hands. When she reached her cabin, she locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. But she wasn't safe. Not really. The whispers followed her inside, growing louder, more insistent. Sleep eluded her. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision. Her phone buzzed with messages from an unknown number, pictures of her sleeping, taken from inside the cabin. The final message read, "Turn around." She refused to look, paralyzed by fear. The room grew colder, the air heavy. Hours passed before she mustered the courage to move. When she finally turned, the cabin was empty, but the bed was neatly made. Her belongings were packed. It was as if she had never been there. She left Ash Hollow the next morning, her mind fractured by the events. But the whispers followed her, faint and distant, yet impossible to ignore. She moved cities, changed her number, even burned her notes. Nothing worked. Months later, she received a package with no return address. Inside was her camera. She hesitated before turning it on, her hands trembling. The memory card contained a single video. It showed her in the cabin, sleeping. The footage was static for a moment, then shifted. The camera panned, moving toward her bed. A figure loomed, its glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. As the screen went black, a voice whispered, "We are always watching."
Story number 2.
Every town has a house that children dare each other to visit. For Barton, that house was on Sycamore Street, a decaying Victorian mansion known as the Howling House. The name came from the sounds that supposedly emanated from within late at night, a low, mournful wail that could be heard blocks away. Some said it was the wind, others swore it was something alive. Eric wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. A skeptic and aspiring YouTuber, he saw the Howling House as an opportunity to prove his courage and gain views. Armed with his camera and a flashlight, he decided to spend a night inside the infamous house. The first thing he noticed as he stepped inside was the smell, a sickly, sweet stench like rotting flowers. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the air was thick with dust. He set up his camera in the living room, its lens pointed toward the grand staircase that spiraled up into darkness. For the first hour, nothing happened. Eric narrated into the camera, mocking the stories of the house and joking about the so-called howling. But as the night deepened, an oppressive silence fell over the house. The ambient sounds of the outside world, the chirping crickets, the rustle of leaves, vanished entirely. Then came the first noise, a faint creak from upstairs, as if someone was walking on the floorboards. Eric froze, his bravado faltering. "It's just the house settling." he muttered, more to himself than the camera. But the sound came again, louder this time, deliberate. He pointed his flashlight up the staircase. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and a cracked banister. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. There was no response, but he felt it, a presence, heavy and watching. Determined to prove there was nothing to fear, Eric climbed the stairs, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The second floor was worse. The smell was stronger, nearly gagging him, and the air was unnaturally cold. He entered a bedroom at the end of the hall, the door hanging off its hinges. The walls were covered in claw-like scratches, and the bed frame was twisted, as though something impossibly strong had bent it. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from downstairs. Eric whipped around, his heart pounding. The sound repeated, rhythmic like a fist pounding on wood. He rushed back to the staircase, but as he descended, the banging stopped. When he reached the living room, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. The furniture had been rearranged into a circle, and in the center was his camera, still recording. He was certain he had left it pointed at the stairs. His trembling hands stopped the recording, and he checked the footage. What he saw made him drop the camera. The video showed him walking up the stairs, his flashlight illuminating the walls. But behind him, barely visible at first, was a shadow. It didn't move like a person. It flowed, crawling along the walls and ceiling, its form shifting and writhing. The camera caught Eric entering the bedroom, and as he disappeared inside, the shadow slithered into the doorway after him. The screen went black for a moment, then showed a new angle. Impossible, since Eric hadn't moved the camera. It was now positioned in the living room, facing the staircase. The footage ended with a static-filled image of Eric standing at the top of the stairs, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. But Eric had no memory of standing there. A cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing his flashlight. He scrambled to turn it back on, but the batteries were dead. The banging returned, louder and closer. Then came the howl, a deep, guttural sound that didn't belong to any animal or human. It reverberated through the house, shaking the walls. Eric bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on it, screaming for help. The howl grew louder, deafening. And then he felt it, a hand on his shoulder, ice cold and impossibly strong. The next morning, Eric's car was still parked outside the howling house, but he was never seen again. His camera was found on the front porch, its memory card empty except for a single file, an audio recording of the howl. Locals say that the howling is louder now, and sometimes if you stand close enough to the house, you can hear faint, desperate screams beneath it.
Story number 3.
Jessica had always been a light sleeper, which made living in her new apartment all the more unsettling. From the moment she moved in, she felt like something was wrong. The space was clean and modern, but it had a strange emptiness to it, like it had been waiting for her. The first few nights were uneventful, save for the faint creaks and groans of the old building settling. But on the fourth night, she woke up to a soft tapping sound. It was rhythmic and faint, almost as if someone were lightly drumming their fingers on the wall. She dismissed it as her upstairs neighbor, rolled over, and went back to sleep. The next night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder and seemed to come from inside her room. She sat up, heart racing, and flicked on the light. The room was empty, the sound gone. Uneasy but determined not to let her imagination get the best of her, she tried to sleep again. The tapping became a nightly occurrence. It moved, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from the ceiling. Once she even thought she heard it coming from inside her closet. She searched the apartment for loose pipes, gaps in the walls, anything that could explain it, but found nothing. One evening, while she was watching TV, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Stop ignoring me." Her stomach dropped. She thought it was a prank, but the timing was too perfect. She texted back, "Who is this?" but received no reply. The tapping that night was relentless, louder than ever, echoing from every corner of her apartment. She tried to record it, but her phone only picked up silence. Desperate, she called her landlord, who assured her that no one had ever complained about strange noises before. He offered to send someone to check for pests, but the visit turned up nothing unusual. Then came the night when everything changed. Jessica woke up to the sound of her phone vibrating. It was a video message from the same unknown number. Hesitant, she opened it. The video showed her apartment, but it was from the perspective of someone standing in her bedroom, staring at her while she slept. She dropped the phone, her breath hitching in her throat. The video ended abruptly, but her phone buzzed again. Another message. You look better when you're asleep. Trembling, she dialed 911. The operator assured her that police would be dispatched immediately, but as she waited, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The closet door, which she always kept closed, was slightly ajar. She grabbed a knife from her kitchen and stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the darkness inside the closet. With a deep breath, she flung the door open and shone her flashlight inside. It was empty, except for a faint handprint smudged on the inside of the door, too large to be her own. The police arrived shortly after and searched the apartment thoroughly. They found no sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else being there. They suggested she stay elsewhere for the night, and Jessica agreed. She checked into a hotel, hoping to feel safe. But as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed again. It was another video, this one taken from outside her hotel room window, showing her pulling the curtains closed. The final message read, "You can't hide from me." The next morning, Jessica's family couldn't reach her. The hotel staff found her room empty, her belongings untouched. Her phone was left on the bed, still unlocked. The only thing on the screen was a single, chilling sentence typed into her notes app. "It's not the walls he's in, it's me." No one ever saw Jessica again, but guests who stay in her apartment report hearing tapping at night. Some say if you listen closely, it almost sounds like someone whispering from inside the walls, begging to be let out.
Story number 4.
For as long as Emma could remember, her grandmother's mirror had terrified her. It was a massive, ornate thing, framed with intricate carvings of twisting vines and hollow-eyed faces. It hung in the hallway of her grandmother's old Victorian home, where shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. As a child, Emma would avert her gaze whenever she passed it, convinced she saw movement in its depths that didn't belong to her reflection. Her grandmother dismissed her fears with a chuckle, claiming the mirror was a family heirloom, passed down for generations. When her grandmother passed away, the house and its contents were left to Emma. She considered selling the mirror, but ultimately decided against it. It seemed disrespectful, as if the mirror was more than just furniture. She moved it into her own home, propping it against the wall in her living room. For the first few days, it was fine. It was just an antique, cold, lifeless. But then strange things began to happen. It started small. She'd catch glimpses of things in the mirror, shadows moving when there shouldn't have been any, faint flickers in the corner of her eye. At first, she chalked it up to stress and lack of sleep. But one night, she saw something she couldn't explain. She was walking past the mirror on her way to bed when she noticed her reflection wasn't quite right. It moved a fraction of a second too late, like a poorly synced video. Emma froze, staring at herself. Her reflection's expression was subtly different. Its eyes were wider, and its lips curved into a faint, unsettling smile. Emma backed away slowly, her heart pounding, but the reflection didn't follow. It stayed, standing motionless in the mirror. Grinning, she turned and ran to her room, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, she tried to convince herself it had been a trick of the light, a stress-induced hallucination. But the mirror began to dominate her thoughts. She avoided looking directly into it, but she always felt its presence, like it was watching her. One evening, she invited her best friend, Clara, over. Emma hesitated to mention the mirror, afraid of sounding crazy, but eventually she blurted out the story. Clara laughed it off, insisting it was her imagination. "See, it's just a mirror," Clara said, walking up to it. She waved at their reflections, but then frowned. "Wait, that's weird. Do you see that?" Emma stepped closer, her stomach sinking. Their reflections were there, but Clara's reflection wasn't waving. It was standing completely still, staring directly at Emma's reflection with a dark intensity. Clara backed away, visibly shaken. "Okay, that's freaky," she admitted. That night, Emma covered the mirror with a blanket, determined to deal with it later. But the blanket didn't help. In the dead of night, she woke to a faint, scratching sound. It was coming from the living room. Her heart raced as she crept down the hall. The blanket covering the mirror was shifting, moving as if something underneath was trying to push through. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and yanked the blanket off. The mirror was empty. Her reflection was gone. Before she could process what she was seeing, something cold and sharp wrapped around her wrist. She screamed, but no sound came out. A pair of pale, clawed hands reached out from the glass, pulling her toward it. She struggled, digging her heels into the carpet, but the strength of the hands was inhuman. The last thing she saw before being dragged into the mirror was her reflection stepping out, smiling warmly. The next day, Clara came by to check on Emma. The house was quiet, the front door unlocked. Clara found Emma in the living room, staring at the mirror. "Hey, are you okay?" Clara asked cautiously. Emma turned to her, smiling. "I've never been better," she said, her voice a little too sweet, her eyes unnaturally bright. Clara didn't notice that Emma's reflection didn't move at all.
Story number 5.
Jack loved hiking alone. It gave him a sense of peace, away from the noise of the city and the suffocating demands of his job. He was an experienced outdoorsman, confident in his ability to handle the wilderness. So, when he heard about the remote Ravens Ridge Trail, rumored to be the most isolated trail in the region, he was intrigued. Locals warned him against it. "People get lost up there," an old man at the gas station said, shaking his head. "The forest doesn't like visitors." Jack laughed it off. Superstition had no place in his life. The hike started like any other. The trail wound through towering pines, the air crisp and fresh. He took his time, snapping photos and enjoying the solitude. By midday, he reached the ridge, where the trail offered a stunning view of the valley below. He sat on a rock, ate his lunch, and decided to keep going, curious to see what lay beyond the marked path. That's when things started to feel off. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. The cheerful chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, all of it ceased. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, but the sky was clear. Jack shrugged it off and pressed forward, telling himself it was just his imagination. As he walked, he began to notice strange things. A tree with deep claw marks on its trunk, far too high up for any animal to have made. A single shoe, dirty and weathered, lying in the middle of the trail. And then there were the footprints. Bare, human footprints heading in the same direction as him. The footprints bothered him. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the dirt, but he hadn't seen anyone all day. "Probably some other hiker," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But as the hours passed and the sun began to dip below the horizon, the unease grew into dread. The trail seemed to twist and change behind him. Paths that should have been familiar now led to unfamiliar clearings. No matter which direction he turned, he couldn't find his way back. Then came the laughter. It started as a faint sound, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it grew louder, closer. It was high-pitched and childlike, but wrong, distorted, like it was being played backward. Jack's pulse quickened. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through the trees. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence. He quickened his pace, the flashlight in his pack now clutched in his hand. The forest around him seemed darker than it should have been, the shadows impossibly deep. And then he saw it, something moving between the trees. At first, he thought it was a deer, but as it stepped closer, he realized it was standing on two legs. It was humanoid, but grotesque. Its limbs were too long, its body emaciated, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its face was pale and featureless, except for a wide, gaping mouth that stretched impossibly far. Jack froze, his body refusing to obey his mind's desperate commands to run. The creature's head snapped toward him, and it let out a piercing, guttural scream that echoed through the forest. That broke the spell. Jack turned and ran, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly. The laughter returned, louder now, surrounding him. Shadows flickered in his periphery, white shapes darting between the trees. No matter how fast he ran, the laughter kept pace. He tripped, landing hard on the ground, his flashlight skittering out of reach. As he scrambled to his feet, he realized he was surrounded. Dozens of them stepped out from the shadows. Pale, twisted figures with grotesque grins. Jack backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stay away!" he shouted, brandishing a stick he'd grabbed from the ground. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, grinning, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Then, in unison, they pointed behind him. Jack turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. Standing inches away was the first creature, its mouth impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth. It lunged at him and everything went black. Jack's disappearance made the local news, but the search party never found him. Weeks later, hikers on Ravens Ridge Trail began reporting strange encounters. Footprints that started and stopped abruptly, laughter in the distance, and shadowy figures watching from the trees. The forest, it seemed, had claimed him, and it wasn't done yet.
Story number 6.
Lila had always loved antique shopping. There was something thrilling about sifting through dusty shelves, discovering forgotten treasures. One rainy afternoon, she stumbled upon a small shop she'd never seen before. Tucked into an alleyway she swore hadn't been there the day before. The sign above the door read, "Yesterday's Echoes." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of aged wood and mothballs. The shopkeeper, a wiry old man with a milky eye, greeted her with a toothy grin. "Looking for anything special?" he asked. Lila shook her head. "Just browsing." Her attention was drawn to a small table near the back where an assortment of peculiar items was displayed. Among them was an old wooden box, its surface intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift when she looked at them too long. "How much for this?" she asked, picking it up. The shopkeeper's smile faltered. "That's not for sale," he said quickly, reaching out to take it from her. But Lila was insistent. She loved a good mystery, and something about the box called to her. After much haggling, the man reluctantly sold it to her, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a warning. At home, Lila placed the box on her coffee table, admiring its craftsmanship. There was no latch or visible seam, no apparent way to open it. She ran her fingers over the carvings, tracing the swirling designs. That night, strange dreams plagued her. She saw shadows writhing in a formless void, heard whispers in a language she didn't understand. She woke, drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing faintly in her ears. The next morning, she found the box open. Inside was a small folded piece of parchment. The writing on it was spidery and faded, but she could just make out the words, "What you seek is what seeks you." Shh. Lila felt a chill crawl up her spine. She hadn't opened the box. She was certain of that. As the days passed, the box began to take on a life of its own. She'd leave it in one place and find it in another. At night, she'd hear faint scratching sounds like something moving inside it. One evening, unable to resist her curiosity, she placed the box on her kitchen table and stared at it. "What do you want?" she whispered. The box shuddered. She jumped back, knocking over her chair. The carvings on its surface seemed to ripple and shift, forming shapes, eyes, mouths, hands reaching outward. The lid creaked open, and a deep, guttural voice echoed from within. "Let me out." Lila froze, terror rooting her to the spot. The box's lid slammed shut, and the room went deathly silent. She tried to get rid of it. She drove to the edge of town and tossed it into the river. But when she returned home, it was waiting on her kitchen table, water dripping from its corners. Desperate, she took it back to the antique shop. The old man's face turned ashen when he saw her. "You opened it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to," she stammered. He shook his head. "It's not about meaning to. It's about what's been unleashed." "What do I do?" she begged. The old man hesitated, then handed her a small vial of dark liquid. "Pour this over the box. It might calm it, but be warned, it will never truly go away." That night, she followed his instructions, pouring the liquid over the carvings. The box hissed and smoked, its surface bubbling like tar. Then it fell still. For weeks, nothing happened. The box remained silent, lifeless. Lila thought she was finally free. But one night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, a faint whisper coming from the corner of her room. Turning on the light, she found the box sitting on her nightstand, open. Inside was a single word, written in fresh, glistening ink. "Shh, run." The whispering grew louder, rising to a cacophony of voices. Shadows poured from the box, filling the room, enveloping her. Her screams were swallowed by the darkness. When her friends came looking for her days later, they found the apartment empty. The only thing left was the box, closed tightly on the coffee table. No one dared to open it.
Story number 7.
Ryan had always been fascinated by urban exploration. Abandoned factories, crumbling mansions, forgotten tunnels, each location felt like stepping into a time capsule. So when he heard about the Ashwood Asylum, a dilapidated psychiatric hospital on the edge of town, he couldn't resist. The asylum had been shut down in the 1950s after reports of patient abuse and malpractice surfaced. Stories circulated about cruel experiments, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of the Red Room, a place that supposedly no one who entered ever left. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and his curiosity, Ryan ventured out late one night to explore the infamous building. He ignored the rusted no trespassing signs and slipped through a hole in the chain-link fence. The asylum loomed in the moonlight, its broken windows like dark, empty eyes. Vines crept up the cracked brick walls and the air smelled of mildew and decay. As he stepped inside, the door creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the hollow halls. The interior was worse than he expected. Graffiti covered the walls, paint peeled in long strips, and debris littered the floors. Ryan's footsteps echoed unnervingly, the sound seeming to stretch and twist in the eerie silence. He started exploring room by room, documenting the eerie remnants of the asylum. Rusted gurneys, decayed medical equipment, torn straitjackets. In one room, he found rows of patient files scattered across the floor, their pages yellowed with age. Then he found the chair. In the center of what looked like a therapy room sat a large wooden chair bolted to the floor. Leather straps dangled from its armrests and legs, stained dark with something he didn't want to identify. A strange marking was carved into the floor around the chair, a circle filled with symbols that looked ancient and sinister. Ryan snapped a picture, the flash illuminating the room for a split second. As the light faded, he thought he saw a shadow move in the corner of his eye. He whipped around, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. It echoed back to him, distorted. Shaking off the unease, he continued deeper into the asylum, drawn by a faint sound, a rhythmic tapping. It was so soft that he almost thought he imagined it, but as he moved closer, it grew louder. The sound led him to a long corridor lined with heavy metal doors, each one marked with many were rusted shut, but one stood slightly ajar, room 237. The tapping was coming from inside. Every instinct told him to leave, but his curiosity won out. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was small and bare, except for a single metal bed frame pushed against the wall. Sitting on the bed was a woman, her back to him. Her hair was long and matted, her frame thin and frail. She was tapping her fingers against the wall in an oddly mechanical rhythm. Ryan's throat tightened. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, stepping cautiously into the room. The tapping stopped. The woman turned her head slowly, too slowly, until he could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stretch infinitely inward. Her mouth opened unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Ryan stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. The woman stood, her movements jerky, like a marionette on strings. She began to move toward him, her head tilting to one side, then the other, the sound of bones cracking with each motion. He bolted, running back through the halls, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The tapping started again, louder this time, echoing all around him. No matter which direction he turned, the sound followed him, growing closer. He finally burst through the front doors and didn't stop running until he reached his car. He sped home, locking every door and window. But the tapping didn't stop. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard it again, soft and steady, coming from inside his apartment. He got up, his heart pounding, and followed the sound to his living room. There on his coffee table sat a single piece of paper. Scrawled in shaky, uneven handwriting were 4 words. "You shouldn't have come." The tapping grew louder, now coming from his bedroom. As he turned toward the sound, the lights in his apartment flickered and went out. Ryan was never seen again. His apartment was found empty, his camera sitting on the floor. The last photo he had taken was a blurry image of room 37, with the faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway, staring back at him.
Story number 8.
Mara hated working late nights at the library, but someone had to do it. The old building was massive, with endless rows of shelves stacked high with books. During the day, it was beautiful, filled with the warm glow of sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. But at night, it transformed into a maze of shadows and silence. The library was nearly 150 years old, and with its age came stories. Whispers of people disappearing, of a bookkeeper who roamed the halls long after closing. Mara dismissed the tales as local folklore, the kind of stories told to scare kids. That night, as the clock ticked past 11 p.m., Mara was finishing up her tasks. The library was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. She was stacking a cart with books to return to their shelves when she heard it. A soft rustling, like pages turning. She paused, listening. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty space. No response. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was just the building settling. But as she pushed the cart down one of the long aisles, the rustling came again, louder this time, as if someone was flipping through a book just around the corner. Her heart quickened. "Library's closed," she said, her voice wavering. "You're not supposed to be here." The rustling stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then she heard the faintest whisper, barely audible. "Over here." Mara froze. It was coming from the back corner of the library, the section where the oldest, rarest books were kept. The section staff jokingly called the crypt because of how cold and dark it always felt. Against her better judgment, Mara moved toward the sound, her footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floor. As she turned the corner, her flashlight caught a book lying open on a table. The pages were blank, but as she stepped closer, words began to appear, scrawling themselves across the paper in dark, jagged handwriting. "Don't look up." Her breath caught in her throat. The air around her felt heavy, oppressive. Against every instinct, she slowly raised her eyes. There, perched on top of the bookshelf, was a figure. It was humanoid, but impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and contorted. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its eyes were hollow pits that seemed to drink in the light. The thing cocked its head as if studying her, then grinned, a wide, unnatural smile that revealed rows of needle-like teeth. Mara screamed, dropping her flashlight as she turned and ran. The light rolled on the floor, casting eerie shadows as she darted through the aisles. Behind her, she heard the sound of books falling, shelves creaking, and something moving impossibly fast. She made it to the front desk, grabbing her bag and keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip them. As she reached the exit, she glanced back. The figure stood at the far end of the aisle, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It raised one bony hand and waved. Mara didn't stop running until she was in her car, speeding away from the library. The next morning, she tried to tell her manager what had happened, but he just laughed it off. "The library ghost got you." "Huh?" he joked. But Mara refused to go back. She quit that same day, determined never to set foot in the library again. A week later, the new night worker, Jordan, didn't show up for his shift. When the staff went looking for him, they found his belongings at the desk, his chair pushed back like he'd stood up suddenly. The only clue was a single open book on the counter, its pages blank except for one phrase scrawled in the center. "Shot. It's your turn now."